The wind had been restless all day, scraping dry leaves across the ground like whispers that refused to settle. By sundown, I had the fire going. Same as I had for near half a lifetime, its glow pushing back the early dark along the banks of Willow Creek. Rosie, my bay mare, shifted against her lead rope ears, twitching toward something I couldn't yet see. I poured my coffee, the steam curling up into the cold October air when the sound reached me, a single twig snapping beyond the circle of light. Out of the shadows, she stepped forward, the fire catching in her hair, her eyes steady on mine as if she'd been searching for me a long time. She stopped just at the edge of the glow where the night still had a claim on her. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had a stranger step out of the dark and change the path you thought you were on. My name's Thomas Caldwell. I was born on the edge of the Kansas plains, back when the war between the states was still a fresh memory for most folks. My father taught me how to mend fence before I could read my mother, how to treat a neighbor with respect even when trouble was brewing. We didn't have much, but we had enough, and that was all a person could rightly ask for in those days. Sundays meant the small clapboard church in town, work shirts pressed if we had the time, and supper, with whatever kin could make it. I carried those ways into every trail drive, every camp I've set since. Most years found me with a herd under open sky, sleeping light and riding long. Life on the range was lean, but honest, a man's worth measured in his word and his willingness to see a job through. I'd been in and out of towns where the railroad brought quick money and quicker tempers, where land speculators circled like hawks over a rabbit warren. Out here, far from courthouse papers and saloon talk, the prairie asked different things of you: patience, grit, and an ear for what the wind might be telling. Willow Creek had been my stop for 15 years when the work took me south of Dodge. I never put much thought into why I favored that spot over any other. The grass grew thick for the horses, the water ran clean, and the cottonwoods held the wind at bay. Lately, though, I'd begun to notice a quiet there, the kind that settles into your bones and makes the world feel smaller, closer. Folks in town spoke of boundaries best respected, but no one ever told me straight what lay beyond them. That evening, with the fire steady and Rosie settled, I felt the air shift like the land was holding its breath. The shadows moved different not from the wind, but from something alive within them. I could hear the creek, smell the damp earth, and somewhere between those sounds was the sense that I wasn't alone. I was just reaching for another stick of wood when I caught sight of movement again, low and sure-footed, as if whoever it was knew every inch of ground between us. I stayed where I was, one hand near the coffee pot, the other close enough to my Colt to find it without looking. Out here, a man learned to let the other party show their purpose before making his own clear. The figure drew closer, and the fire picked out more than one shape in the dark. I could see the gleam of eyes watching, waiting the way you'd watch a trail fork to see which way a rider might turn. Then she stepped fully into the light, and I knew the night was about to take a turn I couldn't have planned for. Ayana stepped in close enough for the fire to show the beadwork across her shoulders, each stitch catching a glint before the shadow claimed it again. She said her name without hurry, her voice carrying the cadence of another tongue. Behind her, 3 figures eased into sight. The tallest wore her hair in long braids, woven with bits of feather and polished bone. Another, younger by a few years, kept her gaze low but steady. The smallest looked barely grown, her round cheeks still holding the softness of youth. "This is Kasina Ayana," said, nodding to the one with the braids. "Diani and Chitlali." Her hand moved to each in turn, the introductions as measured as her step. They sat around the fire without asking, finding places on the packed earth where the light reached but did not overwhelm. The faint scent of sweetgrass clung to their clothes, mingling with the sharper tang of wood smoke. Kasina spoke first, her tone, even as though she was used to being answered. "You travel alone?" I kept my voice level. "Most times, yes. A man gets used to it after a while." Diane leaned forward, elbows on her knees, eyes fixed on mine. Are you not afraid? The question held no mockery, just plain curiosity. I thought a moment before answering. Fear has its uses out here, same as fire or a good horse. It's when you forget, it's there you run into trouble. Chitlali reached into a pouch at her side, drawing out a strip of dried meat darkened with herbs. I didn't recognize. She set it in my palm without ceremony. From the last hunt, she said. I tasted it slow, the flavor deep and unfamiliar, and nodded my thanks. The four of them watched the flames with the kind of patience that belongs to people who measure time in seasons, not hours. You have been coming here many years, Ayana said, not asking. Close to 15, I told her. Always liked this bend in the creek. Casina's eyes lowered, her voice quieter. It was sacred to our people before your kind came. I felt the truth in it without needing to be told. There was something in the air here, clean water, sure, but more than that. Nights spent at this camp always seemed to settle deeper. The dreams sharper in detail, the silence heavier with meaning. For a while no one spoke. Rosie shifted in the shadows, her saddle leather creaking. An owl called once far off, then again. Diane's voice broke the quiet. Our grandmother wishes to meet you. Ayana added, tomorrow when the sun is highest. She has dreamed of the firekeeper for many moons. The word sat strangely in my mind, but I reckoned it was as good a name as any for a man who kept fires in lonely places. I'd be honored, I said. Ayana gave a small nod, and in that moment, the air seemed to change again. The four of them rose without hurry, gathering whatever they'd brought, and stepped back into the dark. We know these paths better than the deer, she said over her shoulder. We will be safe. Then they were gone, swallowed up by the night, as if they'd never been there at all. I sat until the fire burned low, turning the word firekeeper over in my thoughts. I'd spent decades lighting flames in empty country, never thinking who might see them besides myself. The meat seasoning lingered on my tongue, and so did the look in Ayana's eyes, not wary, not fully open, but carrying the weight of something older than either of us. When the coals dimmed to red, I banked them, rolled my blankets, and let the sounds of the creek pull me towards sleep. My dreams were full of shifting light and voices I couldn't quite understand. I woke early, as I always did, to a sky thick with rain clouds. Rosie's coat was cool under my hand as I saddled her, the air smelling of dust about to turn to mud. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the first drops had begun to fall. I stood under the cottonwood, watching the ground darken and the creek swell. Shapes moved through the curtain of rain, more than the four I'd met. A dozen or more walking with the same steady pace, their clothing darkened by water, but their steps sure. At their center came an old woman, small in height, but carrying a presence that seemed to draw the air toward her. Her hair, white as river foam, was braided with bits of shell and carved wood. Lines marked her face, but her eyes were steady and alive. She stopped across from me, Ayana, at her side. Grandmother Ayana said, "This is the firekeeper." The old woman studied me without speaking, her gaze moving over my face, my hands the fire pit at my feet. I took off my hat, holding it against my chest. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but carried past the rain. You have kept the fire burning in this place for many seasons. Yes, ma'am, I said. Her eyes seemed to search for something in mine. My dreams have shown me this fire and the man who tends it. She paused, the faintest smile touching her mouth. You have honored the spirits here. The rain pattered harder against the leaves overhead. She gestured toward the ground, and I sat. Her people formed a loose circle, some standing, some crouched near the earth. This place is where the spirits gather, she said. Your fire has been their beacon. I listened, the sound of the rain and her voice weaving together. She reached inside her clothing, bringing out a small bundle wrapped in deer hide. When she opened it, the light caught on a carved piece of turquoise shaped like a flame. "This was made by my great-great-grandmother, a keeper of the sacred fires," she said, holding it, so I could see the lines worn smooth with age. "It is meant for one who knows how to tend light in the darkness." My hands felt clumsy as I took at the stone, warm as if it had been resting near a hearth. Around the circle, her people began stepping forward, each placing something before me: a feather, a carved bone, a twist of dried herbs, a length of braided cord, a piece of worked flint. They spoke a few words over each gift, explaining its use or meaning. The air was heavy with rain and the scent of sage. When the last gift was placed, the old woman stood. "You will keep the fire still," she said, "but now you will know why." I nodded, the turquoise flame resting in my palm. The rain eased sunlight breaking through in long, pale bands. Ayana stepped closer, her eyes holding mine for a moment. "We will visit again," she said quietly. As they turned to go, the turquoise caught the sun, throwing a brief flash of green-blue across the wet ground. I slid it onto a cord and placed it around my neck, feeling its weight settle against my chest. Tomorrow I would light the fire with different hands. The rain tapered off by late afternoon, leaving the ground dark and rich with the smell of wet earth. I sat beneath the cottonwood, turning the turquoise flame between my fingers, watching how it caught the last thin light before dusk. Rosie grazed nearby, her tail switching lazily, the leather of her reins still damp from the earlier storm. The fire I'd kept going since morning had burned down to steady coals, the kind that gave more heat than show, and I thought of the grandmother's words about tending light in the darkness. That night, I built the fire with more care than I could remember giving it before. I stacked the kindling with the ends, even laid the larger pieces, so they'd catch slow but steady, and struck the match without rushing. The flames rose in a measured way, licking at the logs, their light casting longer shadows now that the clouds had broken and the stars were making themselves known. I kept the turquoise flame close, the cord resting against my collarbone, the carved stone warm from the heat. Not long after, full dark movement came from the far side of the creek. The sound was faint, but certain steps on damp ground, a rhythm too even for an animal. Ayana appeared first, then Katsina Diani and Chitlali, the glow from the fire tracing the outlines of their faces. They carried small bundles wrapped in cloth, setting them down near the flames before taking their seats. The bundles held strips of smoked venison flatbread and dried berries, each offering placed where I could reach it. Ayana spoke in a low voice. "The grandmother says the spirits are pleased." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask her to. The others joined in, telling short stories about their recent hunt, the trouble a wayward pony had caused in the night, and the early signs of a hard winter. I listened, answering, when I could, the easy rhythm of their talk blending with the crackle of the fire. Through the cold months that followed, their visits came without warning. Sometimes it was Ayana alone, sometimes the four together, always at the edge of the light, until I gave a nod to join me. They brought food news and the quiet company that makes the prairie less empty. The turquoise flame never seemed to cool, its color deep and steady, as if it held its own ember inside. On the hardest nights, when the wind pressed against the tent flaps and the snow made a white wall between me and the rest of the world, I'd take it in hand and feel a kind of steadiness settle over me. By the time the thaw came, the grass by the creek was already showing green shoots. The herds I'd been moving wintered well, and my work took me farther north for a few weeks. I carried the turquoise with me, tied under my shirt, and kept the fires in the same careful way, no matter where I camped. When I returned to Willow Creek, the cottonwoods were heavy with new leaves, their shadows moving like slow water in the afternoon light. That evening, I found the fire pit, just as I'd left it, the stones still set in a wide circle. I cleared out the old ash, laid fresh wood, and lit it as the sun dipped low. Rosie drank from the creek, lifting her head now and then to watch the tree line. Not long after the flames took hold, a single figure approached. It was the grandmother. She walked with the same measured pace as before, a walking stick in her right hand, her braids bound with fresh strips of cloth dyed in deep earth tones. I rose to meet her, offering my arm when she reached the uneven ground by the fire. She accepted her hand, surprisingly firm. We sat together, without speaking for a long moment, the fire snapping softly between us. "The fire burns well," she said at last. I nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Her gaze moved from the flames to the turquoise at my chest. "You understand now, the honor and the burden." I touched the stone lightly through my shirt. "I think I'm beginning to." She gave a faint smile, the kind that spoke more than her words. "The spirits have chosen their guardian. You have kept your promise to them." We stayed there as the night came, on the cottonwood swaying overhead, the stars clear and close. At length she rose, leaning on her stick. I stood with her, the firelight showing the lines in her face and the strength still in her bearing. She looked straight into my eyes. "The fire does not belong to you," she said. "You belong to the fire. Remember this, and it will never lead you astray." I watched her make her way back toward the darkness, her steps sure even without the path lit. When she was gone, I sat again, feeding another log into the flames. The words she'd left me with stayed in my mind, their meaning settling in slow. I had wandered most of my life without calling any one place my own. Now I understood that my place wasn't marked by fences or deeds, but by the keeping of something that belonged to many. The turquoise flame rested warm against my skin, steady as a second heartbeat. I knew the next time the wind shifted and the shadows gathered, I'd be ready to meet whatever stepped out of them. The days that followed the grandmother's visit carried the slow rhythm of early summer. Willow Creek ran clear and full. From the spring melt, its banks lined with wildflowers, bending under the weight of honeybees. I kept my work steady, moving cattle to better grazing, mending the stretch of fence where last winter's wind had bowed the posts, riding the perimeter each morning before the heat took hold. Every evening, I built the fire with the same deliberate care, the turquoise flame warm against my chest, its color deep as a shaded pool. One night near the end of June, the air shifted in that way I'd come to recognize. Ayana stepped into the circle of light, her hair braided tight, her eyes holding a trace of urgency. Kasina Diani and Chitlali followed their movements, quiet but brisk. They settled close without ceremony. Ayana spoke first. "The grandmother has been unwell. She asks for your fire to burn high these nights." Her tone was plain, but I understood it as a request that carried weight. I added more wood until the flames rose tall, their light throwing long shadows into the trees. Kasina laid a bundle near me, unwrapping a hide to show a pouch of dried sage. "Burn this when the night is still. It carries our prayers." I set it beside the kindling. Diani busied herself with tending Rosie, running a brush down her neck and speaking in soft tones. Chitlali handed me a strip of smoked meat, the edges dark and crisp. We stayed like that for a while, the fire snapping the sage's sharp scent, mixing with the smell of the creek. The following day, I rode into town for supplies, flour, coffee, salt, and a coil of new rope. The main street was busy with wagons from nearby ranches. Outside the mercantile, I crossed paths with Henry Calloway, the post rider. He tipped his hat. "Caldwell got something came in for you." From his satchel, he pulled a folded paper sealed with plain wax. My name was written in a careful hand I didn't recognize. I tucked it into my vest, finished my errands, and started back for camp. By the time I reached Willow Creek, the sun was low, and the sky had taken on that copper light that comes just before dusk. I lit the fire first, then sat with the paper in hand. The seal broke easily. Inside, the writing was neat but firm. "The one you keep the fire for will soon walk a harder trail. Be ready." There was no signature. That night I burned the sage as Cassina had shown me the smoke curling upward, carrying a scent that seemed to settle into the very bark of the cottonwoods. The fire burned higher, the turquoise warm against my skin. I kept watch until the moon stood overhead, the only sounds the creak and the low crackle of the flames. 2 days later they came again, not 4 this time, but 6. Ayana led them, her face shadowed by the hood of her cloak. Behind her walked 2 older men I had not met before. Both carried bows, their quivers full, and each moved with the same sure-footed grace as the women. Ayana introduced them as her uncles Samuel and Elias. They nodded in greeting, their eyes taking in the fire, the turquoise, and the offerings that still lay near the stones. Elias spoke after a long pause. There may be those who would see this fire gone, not all welcome what it means. His words were measured without threat, but clear enough. Samuel added, "If trouble comes, you will not stand alone." I gave a nod, feeling the truth of it settle in my chest. We shared the meal they'd brought, roasted rabbit corn cakes wrapped in leaves and a small pot of sweet tea brewed from wild mint. Afterward, Ayana stood near the fire, her gaze steady on mine. "When the moon is full again, the grandmother will return. She says the firekeeper will have a choice to make." She didn't say more, and I didn't press her. The flames between us seemed to speak their own language, each pop and hiss a word I couldn't quite translate, but understood all the same. When they left, the night felt heavier, the air thick with the weight of what was coming. I banked the fire but kept the turquoise in my hand until sleep pulled me under. In the quiet before dawn, I woke to the sound of Rosie shifting uneasily, her ears flicking toward the tree line. The first light was still weak, the grass damp with dew, and somewhere out beyond the reach of the fire's glow, a single rider waited on the rise. The rider held his place on the rise until the light grew stronger. The mist was thinning when he nudged his horse down toward the creek, the sound of hooves muffled in the damp grass. As he drew closer, I recognized him as Nathan Cole, a rancher from 20 miles west who sometimes traded cattle in Dodge. He was a man of few words, his face weathered and unreadable. He dismounted without hurry, tying his roan to a low branch before walking over. "Morning, Caldwell," he said. I returned the greeting, waiting for him to speak his purpose. His eyes went to the fire pit, then to the turquoise at my chest. "Word's been traveling," he said, keeping his tone level. "Some folks don't take kindly to what they don't understand." I asked him straight if that talk was coming from town. He gave a slow nod. "Couple of men at the saloon were asking after you. One of them's no stranger to trouble, name's Amos Rudd." The name was familiar. Rudd had a hand in more than one land dispute and wasn't known for settling matters fair. Nathan said he'd overheard Rudd telling another man about putting out a fire that draws the wrong kind of company. Nathan shifted his weight, glancing toward the creek. "Figured you ought to know before he comes calling." I thanked him, offering coffee before his ride back, but he shook his head. "Can't stay. Just keep your eyes open." He mounted and turned west, the sound of his horse fading into the hills. That evening, Ayana came alone, moving quickly as the light faded. She stood close to the fire, her breath showing in the cooling air. "There is talk of a man who wishes to end what you keep here," she said. Her voice was calm, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She told me the grandmother had heard the same from others along the trail. She says the firekeeper must be ready to stand. I added fresh wood until the flames stood tall, their light pushing back the shadows. Ayana handed me a small leather pouch. "This is cedar from our people. Burn it when you feel the air change." She stayed only a short while, leaving before the moon rose, her figure disappearing among the cottonwoods. The next 2 days passed quiet. I worked along the northern fence, repaired a broken stirrup, and kept my fire going each night. On the third morning, a wagon approached from the east, driven by a man I didn't know. He pulled up near the edge of camp, sitting high on the seat with the reins in one hand. "You Caldwell?" he asked. I nodded. He leaned down, tossing a folded paper toward me. "From Amos Rudd." Without another word, he turned the wagon and headed back the way he came. The note was short: "Best douse your fire before someone else does." There was no signature needed. I put the paper into the flames, watching the edges curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. That night, I burned the cedar, the sharp, clean smoke lifting into the still air. Near midnight, Rosie stirred her ears, pricked toward the tree line. I stayed by the fire, my hand resting on the Colt at my side. The night held steady, no sound but the creak and the low hiss of the wood. Still, I felt the weight of eyes in the dark. At first light, I saddled Rosie and rode into Dodge. The main street was waking up, wagons rattling over the boards, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the cafe. I tied off in front of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Marlowe was inside, sorting through a stack of wanted notices. He looked up as I stepped in. "Caldwell." "What brings you in this early?" I told him about the note and Rudd's name in it. Marlowe's brow furrowed. "Rudd's been in here before, but never for anything that stuck. He's got friends who'd rather keep it that way." He leaned back in his chair. "I'll keep an ear to the ground, but you'd best be ready to handle this yourself." Before leaving, I stopped at the blacksmith's to have a loose shoe fixed on Rosie. The smith, Oliver Hayes, worked in steady rhythm, the ring of his hammer carrying into the street. "Heard Rudd's been running his mouth," Oliver said without looking up. "Careful around him. He's not the type to warn twice." By the time I returned to Willow Creek, the sun was dipping low. I set about building the fire high, adding cedar to the wood. The turquoise was warm against my chest, the air still but charged as if the night was holding its breath. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called, and I knew the quiet was about to change. The owl's call faded into the stillness, and for a time, nothing moved. Then a shape eased out of the tree line, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat despite the mild night. He stopped just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. "You Caldwell?" The voice was low but carried. I kept my seat on the log, hands resting easy. "That's right." He stepped forward, the light showing a square jaw and eyes that never settled. "Name's Amos Rudd. I hear you've been keeping a light burning that don't belong here." I told him the fire was mine to tend, and it had been burning here long before he took an interest. His mouth twisted, half smile, half threat. Interest is all it takes when something draws the wrong kind of folks. His gaze flicked toward the turquoise at my chest, then back to my face. Rudd stepped closer, boots grinding in the gravel. "I'll make this plain. Let it die out, or I'll see to it myself." The air between us held steady, the fire popping in the quiet. I didn't answer right away. He took that for defiance. "You've got until the next full moon," he said, turning and walking back into the dark without looking over his shoulder. I sat a long while after he was gone, adding a fresh log to the flames. The turquoise was warm against my chest, and I thought of the cedar pouch Ayanna had given me. I burned a pinch, the smoke curling into the night like a signal. At first light, I rode south to the Calloway homestead. Nathan met me in the yard, a saddle slung over one arm. I told him what Rudd had said. He listened without interrupting, then nodded toward the house. "Best you talk to my wife. She's heard things from town." Inside, Clara Calloway set down her mending and poured coffee. "2 nights ago, Rudd was at the saloon saying you'd brought trouble here," she said. "He's trying to get men behind him." Her eyes were steady. "You'd best be careful where you ride alone." That evening, I built the fire high again. Just after dusk, Ayanna and Cassina appeared, each carrying a bundle. Ayana's held strips of venison and a small clay jar sealed with wax. For strength, she said. Casina's bundle was a folded length of cloth dyed deep red. Wrap this around your arm when you burn the cedar. It will mark you to the spirits as one who stands. We ate by the fire, the food warm and filling. Ayana spoke of the grandmother's dream, a fire burning bright while a shadow moved around it, never stepping into the light. She says the shadow will test the firekeeper. Her gaze held mine as the flames threw gold across her face. Before they left, Casina pressed the red cloth into my hand. The moon will be full soon. Keep the fire strong. I watched them fade into the dark, their shapes blending with the cottonwoods until nothing remained but the sound of the creek. The next day, I rode into Dodge to speak again with Sheriff Marlowe. He was leaning against the hitch rail talking with a pair of deputies. When I told him about Rudd's visit, his jaw tightened. I can't arrest a man for words, Caldwell, but if he steps onto your camp with harm in mind, I'll see to him. I stocked up on flour coffee and extra cartridges before heading back. The trail home felt quieter than usual, the wind low and the sky pale with the promise of rain. By the time I reached Willow Creek, clouds were stacked high to the west. I set the fire and wrapped the red cloth around my left arm, its weight a reminder of the promise I'd made. As the light faded, I thought I saw movement on the ridge beyond the creek, not close, but there long enough to be sure I wasn't alone. The fire burned steady cedar smoke drifting upward in a thin column. Somewhere out there, Rudd was waiting for the moon to rise. The ridge stayed quiet for the next 2 nights, though I could feel something moving just beyond sight. The moon was starting its slow climb toward full, its pale light washing the cottonwoods and laying silver across the creek. I kept the cedar burning each evening, the red cloth tied firm around my arm, the turquoise warm against my chest. On the 3rd night, the stillness broke. Rosie's head came up, first ears fixed toward the tree line. A moment later, I caught the sound of boots on stone. Amos Rudd stepped into view with 2 men behind him. Both carried rifles. They stopped just short of the firelight, the smell of trail dust clinging to their coats. Rudd looked at the flames like a man sizing up a fence he meant to tear down. "I told you to let it die," he said. "Looks to me like it's burning brighter." I stayed seated on the log, hands loose on my knees. "This fire's not yours to put out." One of the men shifted his rifle, and the fire popped, sending a shower of sparks between us. Rudd stepped closer. "Last chance, Caldwell." His voice was low, but it carried. Before I could answer, a movement caught my eye, to the left, shadows breaking from the trees. Ayana appeared first, Casina just behind her, and with them came Samuel and Elias, bows in hand, arrows nocked. Ayana's voice was calm. "You should leave." Rudd glanced their way, then back at me. "This is your doing, bringing them here." Elias took a step forward, his bowstring drawn. "We were here before you, and we'll be here after. Go." The firelight caught the edge of the red cloth on my arm, and for a moment Rudd's eyes locked on it. The standoff held in the crackle of the flames and the rush of the creek. Finally, Rudd spat in the dirt. "This isn't over." He turned, his men falling in behind him, their boots fading into the night. I stayed still until the sound was gone, then let out the breath I'd been holding. Ayana moved to the fire, looking into the flames. "The grandmother will be here tomorrow. She says the choice she spoke of is upon you." Samuel and Elias stayed at the edge of the light, watching the trees, until they were sure no one had circled back. We spoke little after that. They left before dawn, and I sat by the coals until the first light touched the water. The air was cool, the day holding the smell of rain far off. I knew when the grandmother came, the fire would need to be burning high. The next morning, I cut extra wood, stacking it close to the pit. By midday, clouds were building in the west, their edges bright against the sun. As the afternoon wore on, I saw movement along the far bank, Ayana, Kachina, Diani, and Chitlali walking with the grandmother between them. She carried no stick this time, her steps steady despite her years. They crossed the shallow water, the hem of her dress darkening where it touched the stream. I stood as they approached. She stopped at the fire and looked from the flames to my face. "The shadow has shown itself," she said. "Now you must decide if you will stand in the light." I added wood until the fire leapt high, the heat pushing back the cool air. She held out her hand, palm up. "If you choose the fire, there will be no turning away. You will be its keeper as long as you walk this earth." Her voice carried over the wind, the words settling like stone. I didn't look away. "I choose it." The grandmother nodded, her eyes steady on mine. "Then tomorrow we will seal it before the full moon rises." The next day broke clear. The clouds from the night before swept off toward the plains. I had the fire built high by mid-morning, its heat rising steady into the still air. Ayana and her kin came first, carrying bundles of wood they had gathered along the trail. Samuel and Elias followed, their bows unstrung but close at hand. By the time the grandmother arrived, the fire was throwing a deep, even light across the camp. She stepped up to the flames and looked at me for a long moment. "You have chosen," she said. "Now you must stand before all who watch, those living and those who came before." I nodded, and she reached into the folds of her dress, bringing out the turquoise flame. I removed it from around my neck and placed it in her hands. She held it up so the light caught both the stone and the fire, the colors dancing together. Her voice carried low but certain. "This man is the firekeeper, chosen not by his own claim, but by the spirits who guard this place. As long as he stands, the fire will burn." She returned the turquoise to me, and I slipped it back over my head, the cord settling against my collarbone. Ayana stepped forward with the pouch of cedar, sprinkling it onto the fire. The smoke lifted straight into the air, white against the bright sky. Kasina tied the red cloth firmly around my arm. Diani and Chitlali placed fresh water from the creek in a clay bowl at my feet, a sign of the life the fire would protect. Samuel and Elias each placed an arrow in the earth beside the fire pit, their shafts angled toward the ridge where Rudd had stood. When the last gift was given, the grandmother spoke again. "There will be those who wish to take what is not theirs. But the firekeeper does not yield to fear. He tends the flame until his last breath." Her eyes held mine, and I knew she was speaking both as warning and as trust. As the sun dipped, the ceremony ended. The others left in small groups, their steps quiet over the grass. Ayana stayed a moment longer. "He may come again," she said, her gaze fixed on the ridge. "But now, he will not face you alone." She gave a small nod and turned to follow her kin into the darkening trees. I sat by the fire until the moon rose full above the cottonwoods, the turquoise warm against my chest, the cedar scent hanging in the air. The creek whispered over its stones, and the flames moved like they knew their keeper was watching. Out here, a man could spend a lifetime looking for a place to belong. I hadn't found it in a deed or a town, but in the work of keeping a light alive for others, seen and unseen. And I knew, as long as I could draw breath, this fire would never die. If you've ever found your place in a way you didn't expect, I'd be glad to hear it. And if this story stayed with you, I hope you'll join me again by the fire.